somewhere beneath the Pacific Ocean, in a darkness so complete it has never known a single photon of light. There are mountains of stone that breathe. They exhale superheated water through columns of mineral smoke that rise 30 meters or more from the seafloor. Their heat comes not from the sun, but from the planet itself, from magma chambers and tectonic forces working far below the crust. And around their base, in water near freezing and under pressure that would crush an unprotected human body instantly, there is life, not sparse life, not a thin biological film clinging to rock by the barest of margins, but dense layered writhing communities of creatures that have never seen sunlight and do not require it. Animals that feed on heat and chemistry instead of light. Ecosystems as productive, in their way, as a coral reef. We are going to one of the strangest places on Earth tonight. A place where the rules of life as we learn them do not quite apply. Where geology and biology have come to an arrangement that no scientist had predicted before 1977. Where the ocean floor constructs its own small cities from mineral deposits and populates them with animals unlike anything found at the surface. Where the protagonist is not an explorer or a creature, but the earth itself, breathing steadily through its own cracked skin. This is not just a journey into darkness. It is a journey into the question of what life actually is, where it can exist, and whether the world we think we know is the whole world, or only a thin layer of it. If you find this slow, quiet exploration of mystery something you genuinely enjoy, I'd be grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe, letting me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you is always a quiet comfort. Now find your comfortable position. Dim the lights, take a slow breath. We are leaving the map behind. We begin in the dark, as the vents do. They do not need our arrival to begin. They have been here for millions of years. The chimneys rise. The superheated water pours upward through the cold ocean. Life crowds around the warmth, with a patience that is not patience at all, but simply the way chemistry behaves when the conditions for it exist. The conditions here have existed far longer than we have. The vents were keeping their secrets long before there was anyone to keep them from. Our task tonight is not to solve those secrets. It is to descend into them slowly enough to feel what they are, to sit with what is known and what is not, to let the strange beauty of these places move through us, the way the superheated water moves through cold stone, finding every crack, filling every space, carrying something essential from one world to another. The descent takes time. That is as it should be. For most of human history, the deep ocean floor was imagined as a desert, a flat, cold, lightless plain of fine, pale silk, where nothing of significance lived and nothing of significance happened. The earliest attempts to sample the deep produced halls of sparse and pallid creatures, animals bleached by the dark and stunted by pressure. To the scientists of the 19th century, this seemed like confirmation of what seemed obvious. Life runs on sunlight. Where there is no sunlight, life thins and eventually fails. The 20th century gave us new instruments. Echo sounders mapped the shape of the seafloor without anyone needing to descend to it. Submersibles gave us eyes at depth, briefly, at enormous cost and risk. What we found confirmed the general shape of the picture we already held. There were plains of soft sediment. There were gentle gradients of cold. There were pale sea cucumbers, moving slowly across the silt. Life existed in the deep, but it seemed threadbare, dependent on the slow rain of organic material drifting down from the productive surface waters above. The mid-ocean ridges had been identified by the 1960s. Scientists understood that the ocean floor was not static. It spread. At the ridges, molten rock welled up from the mantle through gaps between tectonic plates. It cooled, it solidified, and the seafloor grew outward from those gaps at the pace of a growing fingernail, a few centimeters a year. The ridge was the seam of a planetary wound that never fully closed. What nobody had considered was what happened to seawater that seeped down through the cracks in that fresh rock. What became of it as it descended toward the heat, what it carried when it came back up. The possibility that this circulation, this planetary plumbing, might be doing something biological at its exit point had not been seriously proposed. There was no obvious reason why it should be. Life at the surface depended on sunlight. Life at depth depended on what fell from the surface. The chain was clear, if thin. That map was an illusion. Not wrong about the surface, not wrong about the rain of organic material, but incomplete in a way that concealed one of the most significant ecosystems on the planet. The picture of the deep ocean as a thinly populated afterthought was built from observations of the sediment plains and the open water column. Nobody had looked at the ridges closely enough to see what was happening at the cracks, where the earth was breathing out. The assumption that we had understood the ocean, that we had its basic biology, worked out well enough to describe what was and was not possible within it, was the assumption that 1977 began to dismantle. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic reversal, but it spread the way a crack spreads through glass, quietly, following its own logic, until the thing that seemed solid was no longer intact. The map had always stopped at the water's edge. We had simply not noticed how much it had failed to include. To reach a hydrothermal vent field, you descend through water for a very long time. A typical active vent field sits somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 meters below the surface. That is between roughly 1.5 and 2.5 miles of ocean above you. The descent in a deep-sea submersible takes an hour or more. The porthole is dark, almost immediately. The blue fades out within the first few hundred meters. After that, there is nothing to see through the glass except the occasional flash of bioluminescence. Living light made by creatures briefly disturbed by the vehicle's passage. The pressure at 2,000 meters is approximately 200 times the pressure of air at sea level. This is not a number that means much until you consider what it does to solid objects. An unprotected plastic cup placed inside a sample container and sent to these depths returns as a thimble. A human body outside of a pressure vessel would not survive. The physics are simple and absolute. The weight of 2 kilometers of water pressing down from above. It presses on everything with identical indifference. The rock, the creatures that live there, the titanium sphere surrounding the 3 people trying to study it. The cold is a second presence. Away from the vents, the water temperature hovers near 2 degrees Celsius. Not frozen, because the salt in seawater depresses its freezing point below 0, but cold in the way that the inside of a mountain is cold, a cold that is not seasonal and not cyclical, and has not changed in any meaningful way for thousands of years. It is a stable cold, a patient cold, the cold of a place where the sun's influence has long since given out. and there is no light. At 200 meters, useful sunlight has been absorbed. Below that is darkness of a quality different from any darkness encountered at the surface. Surface darkness is temporary, conditional. You can wait for it to end. The darkness of the deep ocean is permanent in every time scale that matters. It has persisted through ice ages and meteor strikes and mass extinctions. In some of these places, a specific packet of seawater in a deep basin has not seen light in hundreds of years. Some of the water in the ocean's coldest, deepest layers has not circulated to the surface in 1,000 years. These are the conditions in which hydrothermal vents exist. Not despite them, within them. The pressure, the cold, and the permanent dark are not obstacles that the vent ecosystems have overcome. They are the context in which those ecosystems built themselves. What lives around the vents is not adapted to survive these conditions in the way that a polar bear is adapted to survive cold. The creatures here have been shaped by these conditions for so long that the conditions are not even constraints. They are home. This matters because it changes the question we are asking. The question is not, how do these creatures endure what seems intolerable? The question is, what does it mean that the criteria for life are so much broader than we assumed? What does it say about life itself that it arrives here, denies the pressure and the cold and the dark, and simply begins? The submersible descends, the crew waits, the bottom approaches. The submersible was called Alvin. It had been in service since 1964, operated by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts. It was roughly 8 meters long, with a crew sphere of titanium just over 2 meters in interior diameter. The 3 people inside during any given dive sat in positions that most people would describe as cramped. Their legs pulled close, their view of the ocean confined to small acrylic viewports, barely wider than a hand. The descent took 90 minutes or more each way. The time at depth was limited by the battery life of the vehicle and by what human beings can tolerate in a small, cold space with limited oxygen. In early February of 1977, Alvin descended near the Galapagos Rift, a section of the East Pacific Rise located roughly 300 kilometers northeast of the Galapagos Islands. The expedition included geologist Jack Corliss from Oregon State University and oceanographer Tjeerd van Andel from Stanford. They were descending to investigate temperature anomalies that had been detected the previous year by sensors towed near the seafloor. The anomalies were subtle, small patches of warmer water near the ridge axis. This was expected. Heat from the spreading zone was a known feature. They were going to measure it more precisely. The vehicle descended into the dark. The seafloor came into view in the lights of the submersible, a landscape of black basalt, broken and rough, the cooled remnant of lava from the spreading zone. The crew moved the vehicle slowly across this terrain. Then the readings changed. The temperature sensors indicated warmer water ahead and below. They moved toward it. What came into the lights was not what anyone on that expedition had been prepared to see. There were clams, large ones, their shells white, packed together in concentrations that should not have been possible on a deep sea floor that supposedly had little food to sustain them. There were tube-like structures rising from the seafloor in clusters, their tips fringed with feathery red tissue that waved slowly in the current. There were pale crabs moving between the structures. The water itself shimmered where the heat distorted it. The same visual effect you see above a summer road, but here in the absolute cold of the deep Pacific. And from cracks in the seafloor, dark water poured upward. Not boiling, because the pressure prevented boiling, but hot enough to visibly bend the light around it. Hot enough that when the crew extended a temperature probe, it registered several degrees above the ambient water, before the probe was retracted in astonishment. Jack Corliss reportedly radioed the surface ship at some point during that dive, with words close to this. Isn't the deep ocean supposed to be like a desert? Well, there's all these animals down here. There were photographs taken, there were temperature readings recorded, there were samples collected, and then Alvin ascended, carrying back with it the evidence of a world that nobody had predicted and nobody had planned for. The scientists aboard the surface ship spent the evening trying to understand what they had seen. The images did not fit the model. The model, it was becoming clear, was not adequate to the subject. Something at the bottom of the Galapagos Rift was doing something that the current understanding of deep-sea biology had no room for. The next morning, Alvin descended again. The vent did not wait for them to understand it. It simply continued. A hydrothermal vent is not a structure that someone built. It is a moment in a geological process. Understanding what a vent is requires starting not at the seafloor, but inside the earth, several kilometers below it, at the mid-ocean ridges, where tectonic plates spread apart. The gap between the plates allows molten rock from the mantle to well upward. This lava cools as it contacts the seawater above, and solidifies into new oceanic crust. The process is continuous. The seafloor grows outward from the ridge at roughly the same speed that a human fingernail grows, a few centimeters per year. Over millions of years, this slow movement has pushed entire ocean basins aside and carried continents with it. The new rock that forms at the ridge is porous and cracked. Seawater percolates into these cracks and begins to descend. As it goes deeper, the temperature of the surrounding rock increases. The water heats. At depths of several kilometers beneath the seafloor, near the roof of the magma chamber, the temperature can reach several hundred degrees Celsius. The water does not boil at these depths because the overlying pressure is intense enough to suppress boiling, pushing the boiling point far above what it would be at the surface. As the water heats, it becomes reactive. It dissolves minerals from the surrounding rock. Iron, copper, zinc, lead, and manganese leave the rock and enter the fluid. Hydrogen sulfide, produced by chemical reactions between the hot water and the sulfur-bearing minerals in the rock, becomes abundant in the solution. The water becomes hot, acidic, and chemically dense, with dissolved material. This superheated, mineral-rich fluid is less dense than the cold ocean water above it. It rises, it moves back up through the rock, and emerges at the seafloor through openings called vents. When this hot fluid contacts the near-freezing water of the deep ocean, the dissolved minerals precipitate out instantly. That fluid may emerge at temperatures approaching 400 degrees Celsius. They solidify into particles that look exactly like smoke from a chimney. These particles accumulate around the vent opening, layer by layer, building structures called smokers. Over time, the smoker chimneys can reach heights of many meters. The tallest known black smoker chimneys exceed 20 meters. They are entirely mineral, entirely built by chemistry, entirely the product of the earth breathing in cold water and breathing out heat. The black color of the most dramatic smoker plumes comes primarily from iron and copper sulfide particles. The fluid inside the chimney walls is held in liquid form by the surrounding pressure, but the instant it contacts the ocean, it flashes into the appearance of thick black smoke as the minerals solidify. A working black smoker looks like a factory chimney, except nothing was designed here. No engineer drew up the plans. The chimney grows because the chemistry demands it. Around the base and at the margins of the plume, where the water has cooled from 400 degrees to something survivable, the ecosystem begins. The vent does not invite life. It creates the conditions in which life is chemically inevitable. Everything alive at the surface of this planet is, in one form or another, downstream of sunlight. The grass takes light and converts it to sugar. The mouse eats the grass. The hawk eats the mouse. The decomposers break the hawk down and return its components to the soil, where the grass can use them again. Every step in that chain traces back to a photon hitting a chlorophyll molecule in a leaf. Remove the sun, and the entire architecture of surface life collapses. The deep ocean receives no sunlight. At 200 meters, the last useful photons have been absorbed. Below that, for the remaining kilometers of the water column, there is no photosynthesis possible. No light to drive it. For most of the deep ocean, this means that life is sparse and dependent on what falls from above. The material that reaches the bottom includes dead organisms and the slow drift of organic debris from the surface. A rain of debris that thins and thins as it descends. Life at the sediment plane is not productive. It is patient. The vent ecosystem is something else entirely. Its productivity rivals that of tropical rainforests and coral reefs, ecosystems considered among the most biologically rich on Earth. It achieves this with no sunlight. The engine is not photons, it is chemistry. Certain bacteria can oxidize hydrogen sulfide, the compound that gives rotten eggs their characteristic smell, and use the energy released by that reaction to fix carbon dioxide into organic compounds. This process is chemosynthesis. In its outcome, it is parallel to photosynthesis. Inorganic materials enter, organic material exits, but the energy source is chemical rather than luminous. The bacteria are not eating the sun's light. They are eating the Earth's chemistry. These bacteria are the foundation. They form thick mats on the seafloor around the vent structures, visible as pale or orange coatings on the rock. Larger animals graze on these mats directly. Others filter the bacteria from the water column. But the most intimate arrangement is the one some of the vent's signature animals have developed. They carry the bacteria inside their own tissues, in specialized organs, and receive the organic output of the bacterial metabolism directly without needing to hunt or graze at all. This kind of internal hosting is called endosymbiosis. The animal provides a stable chemical environment for the bacteria. The bacteria provide organic nutrition for the animal. Neither party is exploiting the other. They have arrived through millions of years of shared evolution at a partnership so thorough that neither can fully function without the other. The tube worm takes this to its extreme. It has no mouth, it has no stomach, it has no digestive system of any kind. Its body is given over almost entirely to the organ that hosts the bacteria and to the plume that draws in the chemical compounds those bacteria need. It is, in a literal sense, a vessel built to carry other life. It does not eat the world. It is a conduit through which the world's chemistry moves. When we say the vent ecosystem is alive, we mean something complicated. We mean it is productive, diverse, and structured. But we also mean something that takes a moment to fully land. It is alive without any reference to the sun. It is life operating on a completely different energy budget than anything the surface world has ever needed. It is a demonstration that life, as a chemical process, is more flexible than any single example of it might suggest. The animal that most people think of when they think of hydrothermal vents is the tube worm. This is a fair association. Nothing at the vent looks quite like it. Nothing at the vent lives quite like it. And nothing represents, in a single organism, quite so complete a departure from the standard model of what an animal is supposed to be. Rivdia pachyptela, the giant tube worm of the deep-sea hydrothermal vent, can grow to 2 meters in length. Its outer casing is a rigid white tube of chitin, a structural protein similar to the material in the shells of beetles and shrimp. This tube is not a shell in the usual sense. It is a home the worm has constructed and lives inside permanently, anchored to the rock of the seafloor. From the open top of this tube, the worm extends a plume of gill-like tissue that is deep crimson from the hemoglobin within it. That red plume, waving slowly in the currents, pushed by the vent's warmth, is the only part of the animal that is visible from outside. The rest of the worm is sealed within its mineral white tube. The plume is everything. It is the respiratory surface, where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged with the surrounding water. It is the uptake surface for hydrogen sulfide. The worm absorbs this compound from the warm vent water and delivers it via the bloodstream to the trophosome, a large spongy internal organ that occupies most of the worm's trunk. The trophosome is packed with chemosynthetic bacteria, billions of them, living in tight association with the worm's cells. They receive the hydrogen sulfide, the oxygen, and the carbon dioxide. They produce organic compounds. The worm absorbs those compounds and uses them. There is no mouth in any of this, no teeth, no stomach, no digestive system. The trophosome replaces all of it. The worm has traded the apparatus of eating for a permanent, internal garden. Riftia pachyptela can grow 10 centimeters in a single year. This makes it one of the fastest growing marine invertebrates ever recorded. The growth rate reflects the richness of the chemical supply it is processing. Given sufficient vent flow, the worm grows with an urgency that seems almost contrary to the slow pace of everything else at these depths. In an active vent field, tube, worms cluster in densities that can reach hundreds of individuals per square meter. Their white tubes are packed closely together, each extending its red plume into the water when the chemistry is right, each retracting it when the flow of the vent shifts or cools. From a distance in the lights of a submersible, a full colony in extension looks like a bed of dark flowers. Red petals open in a garden, no one planted on a floor that has never seen the sun. When the vent weakens, the worms retract. They can survive reduced flow for periods that may extend to months, waiting within their tubes for the chemistry to recover. But if the vent dies entirely, the community that depended on it does not simply relocate. The tube worms die in place. The red plumes withdraw for the last time. The white tubes remain, standing upright in the cold and the dark, emptied of everything that made them significant. The tubes can persist on the seafloor for years after the worms within them are gone. They stand there like markers, records of a community that lived and was sustained and then lost its engine. Patient in death as the living worms were patient in waiting. The vent keeps its secrets. Even the empty chimneys hold the memory of what gathered here. Around every active vent field, the tube worm is not alone. The vent community is not a single species holding out in the dark. It is a layered hierarchy of life, each level defined by its relationship to the heat and chemistry at the center. Each creature occupying a position in the gradient between the scalding plume and the frigid ambient ocean. Beyond the dense tube worm clusters, vent crabs move across the seafloor in small groups. They are pale, almost white, their shells bleached of the pigment that surface crabs use to blend into shallower environments where color matters. Some species have eyes, vestigial structures that may still be capable of detecting the faint infrared glow that the hot vent water emits. Others are functionally blind. They navigate by chemistry instead, following the gradients of hydrogen sulfide and heat that organize the vent landscape as clearly as any visual landmark. On the mid-Atlantic ridge, a different kind of shrimp has arrived at one of the most unusual adaptations in the animal kingdom. Rimicaris exoculata has no conventional eyes. The organs on either side of its head, which look from the outside like pale swellings, are not eyes in the image-forming sense. They are large, flat, photosensitive organs located on the animal's back. Organs that appear to detect the dim thermal glow emitted by the vent fluid. These organs cannot form a picture. They point at the heat and track it. In a world where all useful light is thermal, this is enough. The Pompeii worm lives even closer to the edge than the tube worm. Its name comes from the Roman city buried in volcanic material, and the reference is apt. This small polychaete worm, no longer than a human hand, builds tubes directly on the walls of black smoker chimneys. The water at the tip of its tube can reach temperatures approaching 80 degrees Celsius. This makes the Pompeii worm one of the most heat-tolerant animals ever studied. It survives this proximity to the plume by hosting a dense layer of filamentous bacteria on its back. Bacteria that may buffer the temperature differential the worm experiences, or may break down toxic compounds in the vent fluid before they can damage the worm's tissues. The exact mechanism is not yet fully understood. The worm simply lives there, in the heat that should be impossible, going about its business in conditions that would kill most multicellular life within seconds. Pale fish drift through the water column above the vent community, feeding on the smaller organisms the vent supports. Vent octopuses wait in crevices in the basalt, their soft bodies pressed into rock that the vent water has left warm. Limpets with shells strengthened against the crushing pressure graze on microbial mats. Polychaete worms of dozens of species burrow through the sediment, enriched by the vent's output. Each adaptation is a record of what survived here. Each creature is a document written in biology, describing in precise terms what the vent demands of anything that wants to live beside it. The vent does not care what lives around it. It exhales. The life organizes itself around the exhale. And from that arrangement, something extraordinary emerges. 2 years after the initial discovery at the Galapagos Rift, Alvin returned to the Pacific. The year was 1979. The destination was the East Pacific Rise south of Baja, California. The team on this expedition included, among others, a young oceanographer named Robert Ballard. He would become famous years later for locating the wreck of the Titanic. But in 1979, his attention was on the spreading zone and the vents that the earlier expedition had revealed. During one dive on this expedition, Alvin moved along the seafloor near an active vent field. The lights illuminated a cluster of black smoker chimneys that the team had not visited before. The chimneys were tall, the plumes rising from their tips were thick and dark and continuous. The submersible moved closer. A temperature probe was extended toward one of the plumes. The probe registered 400 degrees Celsius and then failed. The instrument was not designed to measure what the vent was producing. Consider the geometry of that moment. Inside the titanium cryosphere, 3 people sat in a space roughly the size of a small bathroom. The sphere's walls were perhaps a few centimeters thick. On one side of those walls, the ambient water of the deep Pacific sat at less than 4 degrees Celsius. On the other side of those walls, close enough to touch through the viewport glass, water at 400 degrees Celsius poured upward from a chimney of stone that nothing living had designed. The hottest and the coldest water these people had ever been near were separated from each other, and from them by a distance of perhaps 1 meter. Nobody moved for several seconds. The plume continued to rise. The chimney continued to exhale. The failed probe hung in the water. Then someone made a note of the reading. Then they continued the dive, because the work was not done, and the vent was not waiting for anyone's reaction to it. This is often how the most significant discoveries are reported later, not as dramatic revelations, but as moments of ordinary continuation after something extraordinary has occurred. The vent did not pause for the people studying it. It has never paused for anyone. The same chimneys that failed that probe in 1979 were continuing their exhale long after the submersible ascended, long after the paper was written, long after the people who saw it through that viewport had lived out the rest of their lives. There is something in this that is both humbling and clarifying. We go to these places as observers. We descend with our instruments and our cameras and our careful protocols. We measure what we can and return what we have. The vent has no awareness of this transaction. It simply is. It simply does what the chemistry demands. And it will continue to do so for as long as the heat beneath it persists and the plates continue to spread. We are in the scale of what the vent measures time by. A brief interruption. A flicker of light in a place that does not need light. And yet we go back. Every time we go back. Because whatever the vent does not need from us, we find we cannot stop needing from it. Not all hydrothermal vents look like black smokers. Not all of them are driven by proximity to a magma chamber. Not all of them speak the same chemical language. And in the year 2000, a research team working from the ship Atlantis found a vent field that forced scientists to revise almost every general statement they had been making about what a hydrothermal vent was. The Lost City hydrothermal field sits on a feature called the Atlantis Massif, an undersea mountain of ancient oceanic mantle rock in the North Atlantic Ocean, roughly 900 meters below the surface. That is shallower than most vent fields. The rock it sits on is different. Not the young basalt of a spreading zone, but much older peridotite, mantle rock that has been pushed upward to the seafloor. And the chimneys rising from it are not black. They are white, brilliant white like formations in a limestone cave, except rising from the ocean floor in towers that reach 60 meters above the seafloor. The tallest structure at Lost City, known informally as Poseidon, stands 60 meters tall. For context, a standard 6-story building stands roughly 18 meters. Poseidon is more than 3 times that height, built entirely by chemistry over a period estimated at more than 100,000 years. The heat driving Lost City comes not from magma, but from a chemical process called serpentinization. When seawater contacts the peridotite rock of the Atlantis Massif, a set of reactions begins. The rock's iron and magnesium silicates react with the water. The rock is transformed into a different mineral, serpentinite. And as a byproduct of this transformation, heat is released and hydrogen gas is produced. The fluid emerging from Lost City's vents is not hot in the way a black smoker fluid is hot. The temperatures run between 40 and 90 degrees Celsius, cool by black smoker standards. But the chemistry is more extreme in another direction. The fluid is strongly alkaline, with a pH approaching 14. To put that in physical terms, a pH of 14 is the pH of liquid drain cleaner. Life has established itself in this near-caustic fluid and in this different heat among the white towers of calcium carbonate. The microbes at Lost City feed not on hydrogen sulfide, but on hydrogen and methane, the products of serpentinization. They are members of Archaea, a domain of ancient single-celled organisms whose lineages predate the complex cells of plants and animals and fungi. Some of the archaeal communities at Lost City appear to be processing carbon compounds in metabolic pathways that are among the oldest known. Around the base of the white chimneys, snails and polychaete worms and crustaceans form communities less dense than those around a black smoker, but persistent in a way that reflects the field's extreme age. Lost City has been active for over 100,000 years. The black smokers of the East Pacific Rise are typically active for decades before the heat source shifts or the vent is sealed by its own mineral deposits. Lost City has outlasted them by orders of magnitude. This stability is itself a kind of data. Whatever is alive at Lost City has had time to become thoroughly adapted to its specific chemistry. It has had time to become something that exists nowhere else. The deep ocean is not one environment, it is many, and the boundaries between them are defined not by geography, but by chemistry, by the specific language each piece of the ocean floor speaks as it exhales. The discovery of hydrothermal vents did something more than expand the known range of life on Earth. It opened a question that scientists had been circling for decades, without quite finding the right angle from which to approach it. Where did life begin? The leading model for most of the 20th century placed the origin of life at the surface, in warm, shallow pools or tidal zones, energized by lightning and ultraviolet radiation. Simple organic compounds had presumably accumulated and reacted and eventually crossed the threshold into something that could replicate itself. This is the primordial soup hypothesis. Charles Darwin described something like it in an 1871 letter, imagining a warm little pond as the site of the first chemistry of life. The model has a long history and genuine supporting evidence in the form of experiments showing that organic compounds form readily under simulated early Earth conditions. But chemist Mike Russell, working from the 1980s onward, proposed a different location. he looked at the chemistry of alkaline hydrothermal vents, particularly the kind of system represented by Lost City, and saw something that the primordial soup model was missing. The walls of the carbonate chimneys at alkaline vent sites are riddled with tiny pores and channels, natural compartments created by the mineral precipitation. The fluid inside these pores is alkaline. The ancient ocean outside was acidic and rich in carbon dioxide. Across the thin mineral wall between inside and outside, there exists a sharp electrochemical gradient, a difference in the concentration of protons, and the movement of protons across a membrane to equilibrate that gradient is precisely the mechanism that living cells use today to generate the energy currency of life, a molecule called ATP. The proposal is this, that in the pores of ancient alkaline vent chimneys, the proton gradient that living cells now maintain artificially by pumping protons was provided for free by the geology. The chemistry did not need a cell membrane to create the gradient. The mineral pore was the membrane. The gradient was already there, waiting. Life did not invent this chemistry. Life adopted it. This model remains a hypothesis. There are competing proposals. The evidence from 4 billion years ago is fragmentary and deeply ambiguous. But the fact that it is a serious scientific proposal, grounded in chemistry and consistent with what we observe at sites like Lost City, changes the way we think about these places. The hydrothermal vent is not simply an unusual habitat at the edge of the ocean's range of conditions. It may be the habitat, the place where the chemistry of life first found its footing, in hot alkaline pores in a mineral chimney on an ocean floor that had never seen sunlight. If this is true, then the tube worms and the Pompeii worms and the archaeal microbes thriving at these sites today are not curiosities. They are the living descendants of the oldest chemistry on the planet. They have never left home. Every organism that swims in sunlit water, and every creature that breathes air, and every green thing that reaches toward the light is a distant relative, one that found its way to the surface over billions of years, one that learned to use the sun instead of the stone. We are the ones who wandered away from the vent, and when we go back to look at it, something in the looking feels like recognition. When a hydrothermal vent dies, the ecosystem it supported does not simply relocate. It faces something closer to a crisis of survival. The species that built their lives around a specific vent's specific chemistry cannot carry that chemistry with them. They are tied to the geology. And the next active vent field may be dozens or hundreds of kilometers away across cold, dark seafloor that offers none of what they need. How vent species disperse between active fields and how they have managed to colonize new vents as the Earth's geology opens and closes them over millions of years has been a persistent puzzle. The larvae of tube worms and vent clams and other vent species have been found in the water column at depth, suggesting that they drift with the currents and eventually settle where conditions permit. But the seafloor between vent fields is largely inhospitable, offering little of the chemistry that vent larvae need to develop and survive. This is where the whalefall enters the story, and the entrance is quiet and strange. When a large whale dies in the open ocean, its body sinks. The descent through the water column is slow at first, then faster as the gases of decomposition that initially slow the sinking are gradually exhausted. The carcass arrives at the seafloor after hours of falling, and it lands with force on the cold sediment below. What follows has been called, by the biologists who study it, a succession of stages. The first is dominated by mobile scavengers. Sleeper sharks and hagfish and deep-sea amphipods arrive within hours or days, drawn by the chemical signature of the body dissolving into the water. They strip the flesh. Bones appear. This phase can last months. Then the enrichment opportunists arrive. Polychaetae, worms, crustaceans, and mollusks colonize the bones and the sediment around them. They consume what remains on the bones and in the enriched sediment. This phase lasts years. The last phase is the one that connects the whale fall to the hydrothermal vent. The bones of large whales contain enormous reserves of lipid, fats embedded in the bone matrix, that represent an energy store, built up over decades of the animal's life. Sulfate-reducing bacteria colonize the bones and begin breaking down these lipids. The breakdown produces hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct. Hydrogen sulfide, the same compound that drives chemosynthesis at the hydrothermal vents. At a whale fall in this final phase, chemosynthetic bacteria establish mats around the bones. Polychaete worms related to those found at hydrothermal vents arrive and colonize the site. Clams and snails with gill bacteria capable of chemosynthesis appear. The whale fall becomes a temporary chemosynthetic habitat, a small island of the same chemistry that the vents produce, persisting for perhaps 50 to 100 years before the lipid reserves of the bones are exhausted. Some of the species found at whale falls are closely related to species found at hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. The genetic evidence suggests real connectivity. The whale falls may function as stepping stones, temporary oases of chemosynthetic chemistry on the otherwise barren deep seafloor, allowing vent species to disperse between active vent fields without crossing vast, unsuitable distances in a single generation. The whale's death is not an ending in the usual sense. It is a transition. The body feeds a community for decades. The hydrogen sulfide, its bones release supports organisms that could not otherwise cross the deep ocean. The whale, in dying, becomes infrastructure. The largest animal on Earth becomes in its bones a bridge. The hydrothermal vents are not peripheral. They are not isolated curiosities sitting at the edges of the ocean's function. They are part of the machinery that makes the ocean what it is. They contribute to conditions that sustain life, not just in their immediate vicinity, but across the entire ocean and ultimately across the surface of the planet. Consider the mineral exchange alone. The total length of the global mid-ocean ridge system, the underwater mountain range along which most hydrothermal activity occurs, is approximately 65,000 kilometers. It encircles the planet in a continuous broken winding line. Along its full length in thousands of sites, vent fluid is constantly emerging from the crust and entering the ocean. This fluid carries with it enormous quantities of dissolved material. Iron, manganese, silica, and hydrogen sulfide are added to the deep ocean. Magnesium and sulfate are removed from seawater by the same circulation as it passes through the crust on its way down. The ocean's chemical composition, which has remained stable enough over geological time to permit complex life to evolve, is partly the result of this ongoing exchange. The vents are one side of a planetary balance. They add what the crust has taken. They remove what the ocean has in excess. The ocean is not a closed system. it is in constant chemical conversation with the rock beneath it, and the vents are where that conversation surfaces. The heat contribution is also significant. The total thermal output of all hydrothermal activity on Earth accounts for a meaningful fraction of the planet's total heat flow from its interior to the surface. In the deep ocean basins, where the ambient water is cold and the movement of heat from the mantle to the ocean is slow, hydrothermal circulation is one of the dominant mechanisms of heat transfer. The vents warm the deep ocean water. That warmed water rises and mixes with the broader ocean circulation. The ocean's temperature gradients, which drive circulation patterns that affect climate at the surface, are partly shaped by what happens at the vents. There is also a biological contribution to ocean chemistry from the vent ecosystems themselves. The chemosynthetic productivity of the vent communities adds organic material to the deep ocean system. Some of this material from the bodies of vent organisms and from the sinking of vent-produced particles contributes to the food web of the surrounding deep sea. The vent is not feeding only its own community. It is leaking productivity into the wider deep ocean in ways that have not yet been fully quantified. And when a vent dies, the mineral structures it leaves behind continue to influence the local chemistry for years. The chimneys dissolve slowly, releasing their mineral contents into the water. The enriched sediment around the former vent supports the communities of organisms for years after the active flow has ceased. The vent acts on the ocean the way a river acts on a landscape. It shapes the terrain over time. It deposits material and creates conditions that would not otherwise exist. It leaves marks that persist long after the specific flow has changed course. We think of the ocean as a single environment. The vents remind us that the ocean is a process, a system in motion, a conversation between the living and the geological that has been going on since before there were living things to participate in it. Nearly 50 years after the discovery of hydrothermal vents, the number of known and visited vent fields remains a fraction of the number estimated to exist. The global mid-ocean ridge system stretches 65,000 kilometers. Conservative estimates suggest there may be more than 1,000 active hydrothermal vent fields along it. Confirmed and biologically studied vent fields number in the hundreds, and of those, only a small portion have been visited more than once, or examined with any systematic biological rigor. The deep keeps its census private. In 2005, a research team working near Easter Island in the South Pacific brought to the surface an animal unlike anything in the existing biological literature. The creature was large, pale, and covered on its claws and front legs, with dense, silky, yellowish hairs. The hairs, on examination, turned out to be cultivating chemosynthetic bacteria. The animal appeared to be farming microbes on its own body and then scraping them off to eat. It was named Kiwa hirsuta and given the common name the yeti crab for the appearance of its hairy limbs. Kiwa hirsuta was placed in a new family, not a new species within a known family, an entirely new family. The animal was so different from any known crustacean that the existing classification structure had no place for it. A category had to be created. The year it was discovered, 2005, more than a quarter century after the first vent fields were studied. The first yeti crab had presumably been living in its vent ecosystem for its entire species history. without a human classification attached to it. Its family had been unnamed, unknown, and unseen for the entirety of human biological inquiry up to that point. In 1983, researchers working at hydrothermal vent sites in the Pacific described the tube worms and their relatives in enough detail to recognize that they did not fit into any existing animal phylum, the highest category in the classification of animal life. Vestimentifera was proposed as a new phylum, a new branch at the level of the tree, where on the other branches you find all the vertebrates on one side and all the insects on another. A new branch at that level, discovered because someone aimed a submersible's lights at a vent chimney in the deep Pacific and looked carefully at what was attached to it. These are not small discoveries. They are not the discovery of a new species of beetle or a new subspecies of warbler. They are the discovery of entirely new categories of animal life, categories that required the expansion of the fundamental structure biologists use to classify living things. Every vent field that has been examined in detail has produced organisms unknown to science before that examination. Every one, without exception. The consistent pattern, sustained across 5 decades and dozens of vent fields on multiple ocean ridges, is that each new site contains life not found anywhere else. The vents do not share their inhabitants easily. Each field has its own community, shaped by its specific chemistry and geological history. Over the years, the field has been active. The creatures of one vent are not necessarily the creatures of another. Even if the vents sit on the same ridge, we have barely looked, and what barely looking has produced has already required us to rewrite the foundational categories of life on Earth. In the year 2014, a company called Nautilus Minerals received approval from the government of Papua New Guinea to proceed with exploration and extraction at a hydrothermal vent site in the Bismarck Sea, a section of the southwest Pacific Ocean north of Papua New Guinea. The site is called Solwara 1. It sits at roughly 1,600 meters of depth. Its black smoker chimneys are rich in copper, gold, silver, and zinc, deposited over thousands of years by the same mineral precipitation that built the structures. The plan involved robotic vehicles sent to the seafloor to cut the active chimneys apart and pump the fragmented material through a riser pipe to a processing ship on the surface. The ecosystem at Solwara 1, which biologists had documented in a preliminary survey, would be destroyed in the process. Tube worms, vent crabs, microbial mats, and the full biological community of that specific field would be removed along with the minerals they lived among. The company's environmental impact statement included a mitigation plan. Biota from Solwara 1 would be transplanted to a reference site nearby before extraction began. The community the plan suggested could be moved. Marine biologists who reviewed this plan were, as a professional body, not persuaded. A hydrothermal vent ecosystem does not exist as a portable unit. It exists because of the specific chemical output of a specific vent at a specific location. Output that has shaped the community over the years. The vent has been active. Moving the tube worms does not move the chemistry. Moving the crabs does not move the gradient. The animals transplanted to a different site with different chemistry would have no more survival guarantee than a coral reef community transplanted to a lakebed and told to carry on. Nautilus Minerals went bankrupt in 2019 before the mining operation began. Solwara 1's chimneys are still standing, as far as anyone has verified. The animals around them are still living their lives in the dark, without awareness of how close the decision came. But the interest in seafloor mineral extraction has not dissolved with one company's bankruptcy. The International Seabed Authority, the UN body that governs mineral rights beyond national waters, has issued exploration licenses covering millions of square kilometers of ocean floor. The mineral resources in question include cobalt, nickel, and manganese, as well as copper and gold. The global demand for cobalt, which is used in the batteries of electric vehicles and portable electronics, has driven the economic case for deep-sea extraction with increasing urgency. The argument offered in favor of deep-sea mining is that it would cause less environmental damage than equivalent land-based mining. The counter-argument is that the two damage types are not comparable. Land ecosystems damaged by mining are understood well enough to be partially rehabilitated. The biological communities of hydrothermal vent fields are not understood well enough to be compared to anything. We do not have a full inventory of what lives there. We do not have a complete model of how those communities function. We are being asked to permit the destruction of ecosystems we have not yet described. The chimneys at Solwara 1 are still exhaling. The animals around them are still going about their business. No one has asked them anything. No one will. The International Seabed Authority is the body established by the United Nations to regulate the use of mineral resources on the international seabed, beyond the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zones of coastal nations. The deep ocean floor is designated as the common heritage of mankind, a legal status that places it under the ISA's jurisdiction. Since the late 1990s, the ISA has issued exploration licenses to governments and commercial contractors across dozens of nations. These licenses cover areas of the Pacific and Atlantic and Indian Oceans. The resources being targeted fall into three main categories. Polymetallic nodules are potato-sized accumulations of manganese and iron and cobalt and nickel and copper that litter the abyssal plains of the Pacific, growing at a rate of a few millimeters every million years. Cobalt-rich crusts form on the slopes of seamounts, accreting slowly from the mineral content of seawater. And seafloor massive sulfides are the deposits left by hydrothermal vents, concentrations of copper, gold, zinc, and silver that build up at and around active and inactive vent sites. In the summer of 2023, the ISA encountered a legal trigger known as the 2-year rule, a provision under which a contractor that applies to begin mining operations must receive either a license or a formal denial within 2 years of the application. With the deadline approaching and the regulatory framework for deep-sea mining still incomplete, the scientific community produced an unusual volume of public statements. Hundreds of marine biologists, oceanographers, and environmental scientists called for a precautionary pause, a moratorium on extraction, until environmental regulations adequate to the task could be developed. The concern is straightforward. Mining operations at hydrothermal vent sites would physically destroy the active structures supporting vent ecosystems. The sediment plumes created by the cutting and pumping operations would disperse through the water column for potentially hundreds of kilometers, settling on the seafloor and smothering filter feeders and microbial communities at sites far from the extraction zone. The chemical disruption caused by exposing concentrated sulfide minerals to the open seawater column is difficult to model and harder to reverse. These are not ecosystems that recover on human timescales. The mineral deposits that make vent sites economically attractive took thousands of years to form. The communities that developed around them are adapted to those specific sites and cannot simply reconstitute themselves elsewhere. If a vent field is mined out, the site does not become something else. It becomes an absence, a place where something used to be. The argument that deep-sea mining is cleaner than land mining substitutes one kind of harm for another and assumes we know enough about the deep-sea ecosystems to make the comparison. We do not know enough. We have not done the surveys. We have not catalogued the species. In terms of understanding the biology of these environments, we are still in a period comparable to the early exploration of any major ecosystem, wide-eyed, making discoveries with each visit, acutely aware that the list of what we do not know is longer than the list of what we do. Whether the regulatory framework will be adequate before the first extraction ship arrives is a question the vent communities cannot answer. They continue in the dark, doing what they have always done, indifferent to the mathematics being worked out at the surface above them. Step back from the licensing agreements and the mineral surveys and the legal frameworks. Step back from the taxonomy and the geological processes and the evolutionary histories. Let all of it settle, like sediment finding the bottom. What remains is this. Somewhere on the floor of the Pacific Ocean right now, there are columns of superheated mineral water rising from the earth as you lie in the dark. They have been rising for thousands of years. The creatures arranged around them have been arranging themselves around them for as long as the vents have been active. The tube worms are extending their red plumes into the chemical stream. The Pompeii worms are sitting on the chimney walls in their improbable heat. The archaeal microbes are oxidizing hydrogen and methane in metabolic pathways that may be among the oldest operating chemistry on the planet. None of this requires our witness. None of it requires our understanding. The vent does not need to be studied to exhale. The tube worm does not need to be classified to extend its plume. The yeti crab was farming bacteria on its own claws for its entire evolutionary history before a human submersible illuminated it in the South Pacific in 2005. It was no less real for being unknown. It was no less alive. This is something the vents teach quietly, without stating it, that the known world is not the whole world, that the catalogued, described, and understood portion of what exists on this planet is a thin layer of a much deeper reality, that the creatures on our taxonomic lists are the creatures we happen to find, not the creatures that exist. How many families of animals remain undiscovered at the hydrothermal vents? How many metabolic strategies are operating in the pores of carbonate chimneys at sites like Lost City that no human researcher has yet visited? How many vent fields are active right now at locations on the mid-ocean ridge where no survey vessel has passed? We do not know, and the number we would give if pressed would almost certainly be too small. The hydrothermal vents are a reminder that ignorance is not a gap waiting to be filled. It is the natural condition of any sufficiently complex world. A world simple enough to be fully known would not be a world worth exploring. There is always more to find. Always another vent field the submersible has not reached. Always another organism that will require a new column in the spreadsheet of life. None of this is a failure of science. It is what makes the work worth doing. We live on the surface of a planet that has been active for 4.5 billion years. It has been building ecosystems for nearly that long, in places we have not yet looked, under conditions we had not imagined. The vents are one chapter of that story, not the last chapter, not the deepest. What waits in the others is not yet known. That is not a problem. That is the gift. We came here for something tonight, and I want to be clear about what we found. We found life in a place built by every assumption we once carried to exclude it. We found animals that have never seen the sun and do not need it. We found bacteria performing in total darkness and crushing pressure, the same fundamental chemistry that green plants perform in sunlight, by different means and with different fuel. We found ecosystems that have persisted in some form through the planetary scale catastrophes that erased most life at the surface. At the base of the oldest metabolic pathways we have identified, we found a genuine and unresolved question about whether life itself began in the pores of a mineral chimney on an ancient ocean floor. And we found, somewhere in the space between the chemistry and the biology and the geology, something harder to name. A feeling that comes from sitting with places that have been going about their business without us, in the dark, for longer than our species has existed. The vents will continue, whether we mine them or protect them. The chemistry of the earth does not wait on our decisions. The black smokers will exhale their superheated mineral water into the cold dark, for as long as the plates keep spreading and the mantle keeps delivering heat. The tube worms will gather around the chemical stream. The crabs will patrol the warm margin of the plume. The archaea will convert hydrogen and heat into the currency of life. All of this will happen in the dark, at pressure, in silence we will never personally enter. What we choose determines only whether we understand this, whether we have the patience to sit with what is not yet known, whether we allow some places to keep their secrets a little longer, in the knowledge that the secret is not a failure of our curiosity, but a fact about the world's depth, a fact that says, you are not at the end of discovery, you're not even near it. The hydrothermal vent has kept its secrets for longer than any civilization. It kept them before there were organisms complex enough to keep secrets from. It kept them through the Permian extinction, when 96% of marine species were erased and the deep ocean chemosynthetic communities survived because they did not depend on what the surface world was losing. It kept them through the long centuries when we looked at the ocean and thought we understood it, when we mapped the surface and called the work of understanding the deep done. The vents exhale, the chimneys grow, they fall, others rise. The community gathers, disperses, gathers again. It has been doing this since long before there was anyone to describe it, and it will be doing it long after the last description has been written. There is always something deeper. There is always something more to find, and there is always still a profound, beautiful, and necessary mystery waiting patiently in the dark. The vents do not need our silence, but they deserve it.